So, assalamu alaikum, I'll get started inshallah, and then we'll formally get started for the recording. So it's a blessing, an honor, a privilege to be with you all in this beautiful community, mashallah. I will say that I am visiting from Arizona, and those of you that have been here don't realize how blessed you are to be in a facility like this, in a community like this, mashallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless each and every one of you and your families and protect all of us and this institution and make it a beacon of light for the community until Yawm al-Qiyamah. Ameen. We ready? Yalla. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen Sayyidina wa Nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna min fadlika ilman ya Rabbil Alameen. It's wonderful to be with you all here tonight, and we're going to be talking about a topic for those of you that were here earlier today for Jum'ah that I consider one that is very infrequently talked about, and yet that is so central to who we are as Muslims. So I like to get a survey when we get started. How many people have attended a khutbah, a halaqah on the topic of inheritance or estate planning before? A few, mashallah. And how many people have some sort of plan in place? A will, a trust, something? Very few. Good, alhamdulillah. And the reality is that very few of us do. And very few of us think about these things, despite the fact that it's inevitable, right? They say, there's a famous quote by Benjamin Franklin. He said, there are only two certainties in life, death and taxes. Now, taxes are changing, potentially, for better or worse, but the reality of death will never change. And this is something that all of us will eventually face. And so this exercise in estate planning is in part a reminder and a preparation for death. Now, what makes it special and what makes it so important is the emphasis that the Sharia has placed on it. So we talked about in Jum'ah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, among all of the obligations, the importance of inheritance is the only one that is expressly detailed in the Quran. And we talked about the Prophet ﷺ says, تَعَلَّمُوا الْفَرَائِض وَعَلِّمُوهُ فَإِنَّهُ نِصْفُ الْعِلْمِ. The Prophet ﷺ says that learn and teach inheritance, for verily it's half of all knowledge. So why do you all think that is? This is an interesting question. Why is inheritance considered half of knowledge? And why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expressly lay out all of the rules for inheritance as compared to, say, any other obligation within our tradition? It's Friday evening. I want to keep it a little bit interactive. What do you think? Anybody have an idea? Bonds the family is critical. What else? A lot of things bond the family, though. What else? Half of knowledge. Why do you think it's half of knowledge? Isn't so many other things integral to our faith and to our existence? For future generations. Very good. Any other thoughts? No? All right. So, there's many explanations from the ulama, but one of them that's very interesting is that of all of the things that we study, if you want to study all of the different branches of fiqh, they all have to do with things that you do in your lifetime. There's only one thing that you're going to be responsible for that happens and only happens after your death, which is the distribution of your estate. Right? So everything else is half pre-death, and this is post-death. In addition, it involves so many relationships. Who has a family member, or who knows of a family that ended in a dispute relating to inheritance? Show of hands. Who's ever heard of a fight over inheritance? And it's crazy if you think about it, because so many of these people were happily functioning, cohesive families until the death of somebody within the family, and that triggered a dispute. And so that's why it's so important for us to plan. And the Prophet ﷺ says that this knowledge, I kind of describe it here as a forgotten fard. The reason is the Prophet ﷺ says, أَوَّلُ شَيْءٍ يُنْزَعُ مِنْ أُمَّتِي, that this is the first obligation that will be forgotten. I mean, the first knowledge that will be lifted from my ummah. So the reason I asked the question initially is how many of you have attended a seminar on this topic, is because it's very infrequently talked about, despite its significant place within the tradition. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ says that a time will come where people will dispute over an issue relating to inheritance, and they won't be able to find somebody who can answer their questions. Now, this I think is fascinating, because when you layer the complexity of Islamic inheritance law with state law and tax law, federal law, all into one, then answering that question becomes even more difficult. Right? There's another layer of complexity as Muslims living in America for us to answer that question. So this is something really important. This is a faridah. This is a fard from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we'll get into it. So that's on an individual level. Every one of us has this obligation to ensure that my inheritance gets distributed properly, that my kids are taken care of, that my family is supported. All of those things are individual obligations. I also want to talk about from a community standpoint. So who's heard of an individual by the name of John Harvard? And the introduction Dr. Saab gave is wrong. I went to UC Berkeley for law school. But who's heard of John Harvard? Anybody? No one's heard of him. Good. So John Harvard is a guy who comes to this country as a religious immigrant in the 1600s. He's a minister. Okay? He's from England. He's religious. He comes to this country in the 1600s, and he passes away at the age of 30 years old. I want you to think about this. He passes away young. And he leaves a will, and inside of that will, he bequests, he leaves a wasiyah, if you will, to leave half of his wealth to build a library at a yet-to-be-developed university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Anybody have any idea what that university is called today? Harvard University. Very good, right? Anybody have a clue what the size of the endowment today at Harvard University is? Billions. How many billions? How many? 20? 82? 22? Right? So, I mean, the numbers fluctuate, but somewhere above $40 billion is the size of the endowment of Harvard University today. So I want you to think about how many John Harvards there are in our community, right? And what the impact on a societal level will be if we start to be strategic in the way that we own our wealth and distribute our wealth. Right? Look at this beautiful institution. 100 years from now, 50 years from now, 30 years from now, who's going to pay the bills? Right? Who's going to be able to sustain it? How do we do so in a way that we can have many, many John Harvards sitting here in this room that, not only leave a legacy, but also get so much ajr as sadaqah jariyah. So, the Prophet ﷺ, he says that تعلموا الفرائض وعلموه فإنه نصف العلم, that learn and teach inheritance law, for verily it's half of all knowledge. And he says it's going to be the first thing that's taken from my ummah. The first knowledge that's lifted from my ummah is this knowledge of inheritance. So the way I want to sort of go over this today is with a hypothetical Muslim family. Right? We have Ahmed and we have Sarah. They recently moved to Dallas from Michigan. Many of you are transplants to Dallas, I hear. It's a lot of people make hijrah to Dallas from around the country to be part of, amazing communities like this. And they have 2 young children and they have no other relatives here. So think about this as we work through the exercise, inshallah. So just so you know how long we're going to take and to give you an understanding, it's going to be about an hour, inshallah. We're going to talk about what is estate planning. You know, that's a term most of us don't know, aren't familiar with. So what is estate planning? And who needs an estate plan? Is it something for rich people and old people, or is it something for each and every one of us? And what makes a plan Islamic? This is very important. We talk about Islamic estate planning, right? Can I just throw a halal sign on my will with a stamp? Is that sufficient? Now it's halal, believe me. Or is there something else to it, right? And what are the components of an estate plan, right? All of us have heard of the will, but what else is there? Some people have heard of a trust. Some people have heard of advanced healthcare directives. Who's heard of an advanced healthcare directive? A few doctors, right? These are important documents about end-of-life issues, and I'm sure that in this community, just like every community, there are critical disputes between family members at the end of life, and those are very important, that we have a plan for those things. And then I'll give you time for questions and answers, inshallah, because I know that this is a topic that is dense. I'm going to do my best to distill it in a way that you all can understand, but we'll have time for questions and answers, inshallah. So what I would ask is try and you can write down your questions, or try to keep them so that we can keep the flow of the presentation, and then at the end we'll have time. And the same goes for the sisters. Please, you can send down your questions so that you have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So, of course, I'm a lawyer. So anytime you have ever interacted with a lawyer, what's the first thing that you have to have? You have to have a legal disclaimer, right? So, here it is. So, everybody agree? So, what this presentation is this presentation is an overview. This presentation is not legal advice. Don't rely on things I say here and then go turn around and sue me, right? This is just general, sort of information that I'm giving you. If you have questions that you need answered about your personal situation, unique to your family, and everybody has unique questions, right? Those are going to be answered privately. Those are going to be done through individual counsel. If you have general questions, then feel free to ask them at the end of the presentation, inshallah. So what is an estate? Somebody tell me. I told you I like to keep things interactive. What's an estate? You guys got to participate with me. Your land, all your property, everything you own, right? Most people, when they think of the word estate, they think of something like this. Right? Like, it's not what I have, it's a castle in England or something, right? But the reality is that it's also, I tried to find a good job of finding a Dallas home. So this is what I found. It could be your home that you have here in Dallas, right? Whether it's a modest home or it's something in the beautiful communities that you have surrounding the masjid, mashallah, very forward-thinking and rare if you travel around the country to have so much development surrounding the masjid. It's very strategic, right? So these homes are part of your estate. And also the official Muslim car, the Toyota Camry, is also part of your estate. Your car, whatever you have, these are all things that are part of your estate. And for our sisters, not to be forgotten, the jewelry that may be sitting in a bank locker that you obtained at your wedding and have never worn again, right? That's all part of your estate, as well as debts, things that you actually owe. From the perspective of estate planning, we're going to account for all of those things. We want to ensure that they're all accounted for. So then what's the goal of estate planning? What's the goal of estate planning? When we say estate planning, obviously we know what an estate is, so what's the plan? Distribute it to people that you want, right? So partially. Understand it's more than that, though. It's also controlling the property you have while you're alive. Because one type of estate plan is give everything away. You don't have anything, you don't got to worry about it. So we want to control what we have, right? In an intelligent way. And why notice I say control versus own. Because when we put things into trusts and LLCs and a little bit more sophistication, it's not necessarily owned by you, but it's still controlled by you, which achieves the goals that you want. Those of you that are may have properties, may be familiar, or businesses, corporations, LLCs, you'll be familiar with these concepts. And you want to take care of yourself and your loved ones in the event of incapacity or death. Now, what's on average? Do people usually die suddenly? Some do, obviously. But let's go with statistically. Do most people die suddenly? Car accidents and things like that with just khalas, like all done? Usually not, right? Usually there's a period known as what? Incapacity, right? And that can be very challenging. And that's something else that we should plan for and account for. That how do we ensure that things are able to be administered in a period of incapacity? Now, the third point, which is the one that as Muslims we have an obligation to ensure that everything we own is distributed to our beneficiaries according to Sharia. The way that we want to, which is the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated for us in the Quran itself. Right? And so that's part of this planning. And of course you want to do it in an efficient way. You don't want to waste money. You don't want to waste time. Who's heard of the term probate? Like 2 people, huh? Probation? No, not probation. It's different. You're in trouble if you're in probation. Probate is a court-administered process in which you're transferring assets. Now, is that a good idea or a bad idea? In theory, it's a good idea. In theory, the court is going to supervise the administration, and it's going to prevent fraud, and it's going to ensure that things go the way you want. But as a practical matter, and especially as Muslims, it's something that we want to avoid. Because why do we need the court to supervise the distribution of our estate when there are mechanisms within the law to avoid all of that entirely? So whether you're Muslim or not, one of the goals that a lot of people have in estate planning is to avoid probate. Now it's not as big a deal in Texas, because Texas is not as expensive as other parts of the country. But still, nonetheless, the privacy components and the Sharia compliance elements will encourage us to try and avoid probate. Okay, so what makes a plan Islamic? What makes a plan Islamic? The halal sticker that we showed earlier, or what? You follow the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the premise here is that the wealth that we have is not ours, but rather we are trustees over that wealth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَآتُوهُم مِّن مَّالِ اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. That give them from the wealth that Allah's wealth that He's entrusted you with. It's actually Allah's wealth. Right? And think about in this room, how many of you came to this country with very little, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave so much. Right? This is wealth that, yes, we worked hard, and yes, we earned it, but truly it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving to whom He wills. Because there's so many people that work harder, and there's so many people that work not as hard, and yet have even more. And so this wealth is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it doesn't belong to us. But the way we earn it, we have rules about how we have to earn our wealth, how we have to spend our wealth, and the third component is how it's distributed upon our death. So a person understands that if they wanted to open up a casino, that's haram. Nobody needs to tell you that. That's common sense. If you earn your halal wealth and you try to go and spend it at a casino, equally haram, right? This is not something that there's a dispute about. But the third one is something that we forget. We think that, especially living in this country, that we can do what we want with our wealth. And that's not true. It's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rules will dictate how the wealth has to be distributed to our beneficiaries upon our death. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتِ إِن تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. This is an interesting ayah. Allah says it's a duty upon the righteous to leave a bequest when death approaches you. Anybody know why this is such an interesting ayah? Because technically this ayah is mansukh. This ayah is abrogated by the revelation of the ayat in Surah An-Nisa. So when Allah reveals in Surah An-Nisa the verses of inheritance, this no longer applies. But we're living in a time, one of my teachers says, that we're living in a time today where this ayah is actually effectively mandatory on us. Because the law of the land is not يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ. The law of the land is not that. And so if you want to implement the rules that are laid out in Surah An-Nisa, you have to write them down. Right? So it becomes, I would argue, not a sunnah, rather an obligation, a fard, a haqqan ala al-muttaqin, a duty upon the righteous. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the Prophet ﷺ in another hadith which is well known to everyone, that if the 2 nights should not pass if you have something that you own, except that you should have a written plan with what to do with it. And this just goes back to preparation. Just goes back to preparation. We prepare for our kids everything about them, but we don't prepare for the one thing that we know is inevitable. So, Islamic inheritance law, I'm going to do maybe a 10-minute overview. Now this is a complex subject, right? One of the most complex. We said it's nisful ilm, it's described as half of all knowledge, and one that scholars have written entire books upon and spent years studying. So we're going to try and condense it just to give you an understanding. Now I should mention at the outset there are 2 objectives that I have for you in this presentation. The first is that you learn a new subject, because we said very few people were familiar with Islamic inheritance law. So the Prophet ﷺ, he tells Abu Dharr radiallahu anh that لَن تَغْدُوا فَتَتَعَلَّمَ بَابًا مِنَ الْعِلْمِ عُمِلَ بِهِ أَوْ لَمْ يُعْمَلْ بِهِ. That, oh Abu Dharr, if you go out and you learn one chapter of knowledge, whether you implement it or not, خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ أَن تُصَلِّيَ أَلْفَ رَكَعَةٍ. It's better than praying 1,000 raka'at of optional prayers. We don't get that chance very often to learn an entire chapter of knowledge, right? So that's one intention. The second intention is that I want you to implement it. I want you to fulfill it. I want everybody here to create a plan. And we're going to facilitate that for you and make it very easy. Whether you do that with my assistance or you do it on your own or you do it with some other attorney, we want to make sure that everybody does that, inshallah. So, what's the first thing that's paid out when a person passes away? Debts. Even before that. No, we'll see, it comes after. Funeral expenses. What's the cost here in Dallas for a cost of dying? 10,000? 4,000? 5? Okay, so all kinds of numbers, 4 to 10. 5,000. Okay, we'll split it in the middle. So that's not inexpensive, and that's the first thing that is paid out. Now, often family members will pay it, or people will come together and it gets taken care of. But from a classical fiqh perspective, the first thing that is taken from a person's estate is funeral and burial expenses and so on and so forth. What's next? Debt. Okay, now, debt within our tradition is discouraged. The Prophet ﷺ, it's reported that on various occasions that he wouldn't pray the janazah over somebody who had debts outstanding until the people would come and pay off those debts. Now, we live in a society in which people are crippled with debt, right? This is a society we live in which debt is so prevalent, is it not? In everything we do, right? There's home mortgages, there's car payments, there's student loans, there's credit cards, there's you name it, and there's all kinds of debts. So the ethic within Islamic finance is to avoid taking loans unless necessary. I'm not talking about halal or haram, riba or no riba, just in general. Avoidance of debt is something that's encouraged, right? And if we can pay off our loans, we should. But from an Islamic perspective, those debts have to be paid off first, which is very important. Now, understand that there are debts in living in the US that people can assume, even though in classical tradition that's not the case. You don't inherit debt. But Here you could, for instance, inherit a property that is mortgaged, right? The beneficiary could do so. So there's some nuance to this point here. But what I want to just highlight is the fact that debts are to be paid first, which also means if you have debts that are between, let's say, brothers, those things need to be recorded and written because it's important that you have the ethical obligation of paying them back. The person may forgive them, but it's important that we write those things down. What about third? Third is known as a wasiyah. What do I mean here? Bequests. Now, wasiyah, people often use the term will for wasiyah interchangeably, right? In Arabic, people say you have to make a wasiyah. You're usually saying you have to write a will. But within the books of fiqh, this term refers to a discretionary share of up to 1/3. Okay? So understand, up to 1/3, you're allowed to give to whomever you want. With one condition, la wasiyata liwarith. You can't enhance the share of one of the beneficiaries that is going to inherit under the Quranic regime. Does that make sense? That there are people that Allah has guaranteed their shares. You can take out up to 1/3. You don't have to, but you can. This is where we said the endowments are built from. Think about churches, synagogues, hospitals, universities, right? All of them have large endowments in large part because people, when they pass away, they leave gifts to those institutions. I'm curious, has anybody left a gift to the masjid? Anybody know? Has the masjid received gifts on people's passing? So now, just let's pause for a moment. This is a huge institution, one of the leading ones in the country, leading masajid, right? And if you compare it with, let's say, church so-and-so down the street, they probably have countless bequests, right? When members pass away who are supportive of the institution, they leave a gift. And this should be something within our tradition that we do, especially if your children are adults. Now, if your children are young, the scholars actually say this wasiyah is not necessarily encouraged. Why? Yeah, I mean, you're decreasing the share that would go to your children otherwise. But assume your kids are adults and financially stable and independent. What do you think the value of that 1/3? We talked about John Harvard. How many institutions and endowments can we build through this wasiyah? The other thing you can do here is if you have unfulfilled religious obligations, zakat, missed salah, hajj, a person has not gone for, you can write down that you want these things to be taken care of for you from this share. Now that's not to say you can skip all your prayers and just write in your will, somebody give money on my behalf, right? Or never pay zakah and say when I die someone should pay it all. No, that's not the point. But the point is you should write if you missed obligations so that as a fidya for you, that money is taken out. Now if it's not written, there's no obligation upon the beneficiaries to do so, right? This is something you have to write. Then we have the sharia distributions, okay? These are largely derived from Surah An-Nisa, verses number 11 and 12, as well as the last ayah, I forget the number, of Surah An-Nisa. 3 verses. What is Surah Nisa? What does it mean? What's Nisa? Women. It's the chapter of women. And what is the first page or two largely talking about? What's the first page or two talking about? To our hafaz. Rights of people, in particular, orphans. Okay? Orphans. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing is coincidental that Allah lays out the inheritance rules in Surah An-Nisa because at that time, what rights did women have? At the time of the Quran in Jahiliyyah, when the Quran was revealed, what rights did women have to inherit? Next to nothing. I say next to nothing, why? There's a notable exception. Just a trivia point. Khadija radiallahu anha inherited a lot. But that's because there were no male relatives. Right? So, generally, if there were any male relatives, the woman actually got nothing. In fact, oftentimes the women themselves were inherited. The practice was such that if a person had a debt, they would actually inherit the wife. This was an incredible jahiliyyah, or the daughter. This was an incredible time of ignorance. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala radically transforms the society with these rules. That's one of the reasons they're actually laid out in the Quran, as opposed to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I'm going to run through a few points we can derive from these verses. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يُوصِيكُمُ اللَّهُ فِي أَوْلَادِكُمْ, that Allah gives you a wasiyah regarding your children. Your Lord is giving you an admonition, meaning pay attention. And when someone gives you a wasiyah, does that person have your best interest in mind? Absolutely. Absolutely. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you these things, meaning He's giving you a plan with respect to your children. The first provision, right? In today's society, this is deemed extremely controversial. Allah says, لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that a male child inherits double the share of a female child. Anybody see how in today's society, one of the most common questions I get is this, that Allah says, لِلذَّكَرِ مِثْلُ حَظِّ الْأُنْثَيَيْنِ, that a male child gets double the share of a female child. Now why is that? Because men are better? More responsibilities, right? The theory, actually the true answer is because Allah said so, right? But there are hikam, there are wisdoms that the scholars have derived and explained, one of which is that the financial burden is on the male to support the wife, child, children, spouse, mother, so on and so forth. Now, that's the obligation on the male. The female that inherits is entitled to all of her wealth and to keep it and not to spend from it. Now understand though, we live in a society, to be fair, in which that doesn't always happen. The male children, sons, don't necessarily take care of their sisters or of their mothers. And women often don't get remarried. And so it's a challenge that we have to address and think about in this society. So it's very important that we be thoughtful when we do this planning. That we want to comply with the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we also want to protect our families. So there are ways to do this, and we would get into them. Some of them are gifting. These rules only apply on death. So there are gifting that can take place and so on, and other issues. فَإِن كُنَّ نِسَاءً فَوْقَ اثْنَتَيْنِ فَلَهُنَّ ثُلُثَا مَا تَرَكَ وَإِن كَانَتْ وَاحِدَةً فَلَهَا النِّصْفُ. So if there are 2 or more daughters and no sons, they're going to split 2/3. And if there's only 1 daughter, she's going to take half of everything that you own. This is a large share. In fact, the largest share is of the shares in the Quran is half, which goes to the daughter, okay, as well as to a husband in the event that there were no children. But this is the share that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes. Then He says, so this ayah, if you ever want to test a hafiz, see if they really know their Quran, you ask them to read this, okay? So this is a very tough ayah. وَلِأَبَوَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمَا السُّدُسُ مِمَّا تَرَكَ إِنْ كَانَ لَهُ وَلَدٌ فَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ وَلَدٌ وَوَرِثَهُ أَبَوَاهُ فَلِأُمِّهِ الثُّلُثُ. So in this society, do parents inherit? In the US, in Texas, if you pass away, do your parents get anything? Assuming you don't have a will. No. Nobody cares. The Islamic ethic towards parents is one of birrul walidain, of being dutiful to one's parents that extends beyond death. This is very different from the society we live in. So the parents, they get 1/6 each in the event that you have children. If you don't have children, your mother gets 1/3, and the father's going to move to asaba, which I'll explain in a second. And if you have 2 or more brothers, however, the mom's share is going to drop back down to 1/6. Does that sound complex? It is, right? من بعد وصية يوصي بها أو دين آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. This is fascinating. Usually at the end of the ayat, we just kind of take them for granted. Allah says let me actually pose it a different way. Assume you have a 2-year-old son and a 75-year-old father, and you're passing away. Who deserves your wealth more? The son? Why? He's young, he has his whole life to live in front of him. But what about your father who spent his whole life taking care of you and supporting you? Do you not have an obligation towards the father? Towards your father? You owe him everything, right? Everything you have, you should give it to your father. So which one deserves it more? You don't know and I don't know, is the point. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, آباؤكم وأبناؤكم لا تدرون أيهم أقرب لكم نفعا. That you don't know your parents or your children, which one of them is closer to you in benefit. فَرِيضَةً مِّنَ اللَّهِ. These are mandatory shares from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. What does that mean? Allah is knowledgeable and wise, most knowledgeable, right? Meaning you think you know a better plan. Right? We all think we're intelligent people, right? We've done well in school, we have good investments, portfolios doing well. So Allah says, no. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. These are not designed to be unjust. These are designed to be from Allah's knowledge and Allah's wisdom. Meaning I know better than you and I have your best interest at stake. And I think just to go back to that point about how many of us Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is blessed with so much and had so little. And we understand that we trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's the first verse. The second verse is the next one, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala outlines the shares for spouses. He says, وَلَكُمْ نِصْفُ مَا تَرَكَ أَزْوَاجُكُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّهُنَّ وَلَدٌ فَإِن كَانَ لَهُنَّ وَلَدٌ فَلَكُمُ الرُّبُعُ مِمَّا تَرَكْنَ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ يُوصِينَ بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. That Allah says that a surviving, a married woman, if her husband passes away, if a married woman passes away, her husband gets a half of her wealth if she didn't have any children. And if she had children, he's going to get a fourth. Okay? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَهُنَّ الرُّبُعُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ إِن لَّمْ يَكُن لَّكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَإِن كَانَ لَكُمْ وَلَدٌ فَلَهُنَّ الثُّمُنُ مِمَّا تَرَكْتُمْ مِن بَعْدِ وَصِيَّةٍ تُوصُونَ بِهَا أَوْ دَيْنٍ. That when a husband passes away, the wife, if the husband didn't have children, gets a fourth. And if the husband did have children, the wife is going to get an eighth. Okay? Everybody follow that point? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the rule of a kalala. What's a kalala? Anyone know? A person who has neither ascendants nor descendants. Okay? So they don't have above them, meaning father, grandfather, etc. Or below them, meaning son, grandson, etc. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the rule relating to kalala. I'm going to skip over that one as it gets a little complex. And then there's more ayat relating to kalala at the end of Surah An-Nisa, which is the very last verse. But again, I want to point this out. Wasiyatan min Allah. This is a wasiyah from your Lord, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahu alimun halim. Allah is again knowledgeable and forbearing, right? Kind to you. That this is not something that is a sort of system of oppression, but this is designed to take care of those that come after you. Now, I mentioned in Jum'ah, the scary verses are the ones that follow this. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, تِلْكَ حُدُودُ اللَّهِ. These are the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي مِنْ تَحْتِهَا الْأَنْهَارُ خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا وَذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ وَمَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَتَعَدَّ حُدُودَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ نَارًا خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. Allah actually says that whoever follows the rules and obeys Allah and His Messenger will go to paradise. And whosoever disobeys Allah and transgresses the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will go to Jahannam khalidan fiha and dwell in it for eternity. وَلَهُ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. And this is something that is a severe punishment. And so it's really important that we implement these rules and that we follow the Islamic rules of inheritance. Everybody agree with me that this is something that's important, that we have a desire to do, correct? Inshallah. So let's take an example, right? This is all theory. Let's take an example. So remember Ahmed and Sarah, we talked about them in the beginning. They had two kids. They had Umar and Sumayya. I forgot to talk about them. But since then, mashallah, they've had another child, Khadija. Unfortunately, Sarah, one day she was in a car accident, she passed away. Allah yarhamha. So Sarah is survived by Ahmed, her mother Aisha, and her children Umar, Sumayya, and Khadija. So let's do the exercise. Upon Sarah's death, who gets what? Under Islamic law. Let's go to the top. What does Aisha get? 1/6. Very good. You guys are paying attention. Excellent. What does Ahmed get? 1/4. Good. I heard some halves. That's too much. Okay. He gets a 1/4. And what about Ahmed? Umar, Sumayya, and Khadija. So take the remainder and then split it into 4 shares. Give 2 to Umar and 1 each to Sumayya and Khadija. Make sense? Okay? So those are the fractions that each of them should get under Islamic law. Now, there's an important question here though. First question is, actually I'll jump back to the question. Under Texas law, under state law, assuming you don't have any plan, what's the distribution going to be? Who gets what? You got to be louder. Half to your wife. Okay. And? Half to the children? No. So, half to the lawyer. Very good. So Ahmed is going to get 100% of the community property. What's community property? I'm going to go on a tangent for a minute to give you a little bit of law. What's community property? So Texas is a community property state. How many of you moved here from non-community property states? Anybody know? Okay, so the southwest and the west of the United States is a community property jurisdiction. What that means is that as a presumption, and many of the sisters may be happy with this information, that 50% of whatever you earn belongs to your wife. Regardless of whose name is on the account, regardless of whose name is on the house. Okay? 50% belongs to each spouse. Meaning upon death or divorce, 50% goes to the survivor. Okay? This is the default presumption. So everything that's community, and most people, when they own a house, bank accounts, things like that, they're jointly owned. And they are community property. Unless you have what's known as a prenup, right? Or a post-nup, or a property agreement, or a trust. Some type of planning to distinguish the assets. So effectively, in most cases, Ahmed gets everything. Okay? So Sarah says, I mean, it's not a big deal, because mashallah, Ahmed is a good guy. And he comes to the masjid, he prays in the masjid. So, I mean, most women might say, that's all good, you know, he's going to take care of my kids, and he's going to fulfill those religious obligations. Would you all agree? Inshallah. Inshallah is a good hope and not a plan, right? So that is what happens usually. What happens? He gets remarried, right? And statistically speaking, Ahmed will probably get remarried. And so what happens then when Ahmed marries Hajar, who has 2 kids from a previous marriage? And Ahmed still didn't learn his lesson and he didn't make a plan. So now what? Things get complicated, right?
So she gets half of whatever he has.
Things start to get complicated. He buys a house in their community property. Now there's community and there's separate property. There's different types of properties that are going to get at play. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be a distribution. The state law is not so unfair to give her everything. So it's not that unjust that she gets all of it, but she is going to get a significant portion, and the kids are not going to get what they were supposed to under Islamic law. And who gets nothing? Sarah's mother. What does she get? She gets 0. Okay? So we talked about the responsibility that we have towards our parents remains even after our death. That they have a share that they're entitled to. Now they can waive the share. They might say, and they often would say, what do I need from this share? Give it to the kids and let them, live their life. But it's their haqq. It's the right of the parents. Understood? We'll come back, we'll do a few more examples, inshallah. So, everyone agree that we all need a plan, right? So this is something that I said, like we have to recognize that this is important for us. So, what are the minimum elements of a plan? Okay? What are the minimum elements? There's a few of them. One is a will, right? There's a last will. Now, who's heard of a living will? Anybody? Nobody's heard of one. Okay, awesome. Well, there is something that's known as a last will, and there's something that's known as a living will. They're two different things. They're sometimes confused. A last will is an instruction about your assets and who you want to be in charge and who's going to be guardian of your children. We didn't talk about this, but this is very critical that we have guardians for our minor children. Allah forbid if our spouses and we're in a car accident or something like that and we were to die suddenly, we don't want the state to take custody of our children. We want to have a plan to ensure that our children are protected and that they go to family members or friends or so on and so forth. A power of attorney we talked about is for incapacity, and an advanced healthcare directive dictates at the end of life what do you want to happen with respect to pulling the plug. Are any physicians, anybody dealt with a situation that there are family members in which there's a dispute relating to end-of-life care? Anyone ever seen that happen? Okay. Dr. Hamid? Right? This happens. Our communities are not immune to this. Who's heard of Terry Schiavo? A famous case in Florida, right? In which there's a spouse and a parent, and they're disputing whether to pull the plug or not. And this is such a difficult time, and what ends up happening is there ends up being lawsuits. And money is wasted and emotions are, high. And so it's very important that we actually have these things written down for our family members, because the sort of pressure on someone to pull the plug is very difficult to say, okay. And there are people that say, no, give him a chance and this, that. And so you end up in difficult situations. And there is an Islamic ethic to end-of-life care, which is one that we should follow. The last one is a trust, and I'll talk about a trust, because I think for many people, for many Muslims, a trust is the preferred way to go. Now, it's not necessary in every case, but in most cases and in many cases, a trust is the way that that is the most optimal way of preserving our assets. And HIPAA, just to give you who knows what HIPAA is? What is it? Privacy Act, right? So if I walk into the hospital and I say, this is my neighbor, Muhammad, he's a good friend of mine, I'm here to make decisions on his behalf. The doctor's in the room, are you going to listen to me? I say, get out of here, right? Who are you? Do you have the documentation that is necessary in order to, make those decisions for us? So, last will and testament. Okay, I want to talk about this, give you an idea of the benefits and the drawbacks. The benefits, the biggest benefit, if you don't do anything else, is that you name guardians for your children. Okay? Guardians for your children is critical because we don't want the state involved. That's Allah, if something were to happen to my spouse and I want to make sure that I pick people that I really trust to be in the position of guardianship. Anybody with minor kids, you should absolutely have a will. Okay? Absolutely. And you pick an executor or a personal representative, as it's referred to here in Texas, to be responsible for the administration of your estate. Now, this is a big one. That most people don't understand the limitation of a will. If you have a house or a bank account or any type of account with two names on it, and you write a will, a really nice Islamic will, is the will going to control the distribution, or is the joint account? Joint account, meaning it automatically will go to the surviving spouse. Okay? So if you have a house, and let's talk about retirement accounts, life insurance policies, anything with a beneficiary designation. Right? People at work, they have a 401k, or you might have an IRA. Some people have life insurance. Some people have different things. I'm not going to talk about those for a moment. I just want to say, if you've written somebody down there, regardless of what you put in your will, what's going to control? The beneficiary designation. Understand this point. It's very critical. A lot of people do wills thinking that, okay, I fulfilled my religious obligation. But the reality is everything still goes to the surviving spouse. Because the will only controls assets that don't have a beneficiary, or that that aren't jointly owned. Okay? Is that point clear? I want to make sure that I want to drill that point in. That if they're only probate assets, meaning those that are not jointly owned or that have a beneficiary designation already. Yes? Absolutely. Yeah, so this is very critical. If you put a beneficiary, you put your spouse, you put your children, you put whomever you put. And I had a case, in fact, in which a person died, and his wife came to get some assistance after death, and he had a will, and he had a previous wife that he had divorced, and he forgot to change the beneficiary designation on that retirement account, and it was a few $100,000. Do you know who got that retirement account? The two wives prior now, basically. Right? One was his widow, and the one before, regardless of what happened, his will and the second marriage, the first one got the account. And you could go fight it in court and waste lots and lots of money. But the point is, those are really critical. So when we talk about comprehensive planning, we have to think about that as well. And a will goes to probate. This is important as well. The court has to prove that your will is true. Because I could just write a will and say, this is my brother's will, and it said, leave everything to my brother. Right? There has to be a process of verification. So the court has to approve the validity of the will. And like I said, in Texas, it's not that big of a deal. Probate is not that huge of an expense. But nonetheless, it's something that you want to avoid. If you have Islam and you have rules and you go to some judge that is pretty racist, there are some, we all know, and the judge looks at this and says, Sharia, I'm throwing it out. Okay, then you got to call CARE and you have to have another law. I mean, it's just totally unnecessary. If you can avoid it, you should. Okay? So, but one of my goals is that I want every Muslim in America to have a will, at a minimum. Like I said, many need trusts, but we want to start with the will. So one of the things that we developed, and I'm very excited about this, and this is just the second time we're doing this, so it's still in development, is we've developed a free tool for you to create a will. So you're going to go, and I'm going to give you a chance, and I want everybody to take out their phones. This is probably the one time in the masjid somebody told you take out your phone. All right? Most of you already have your phones out, so you don't need to take a picture of this slide. You can actually do it. Okay? So if you send a text message with the word Irving to the number 444999, okay? I'll give you a second. You text the word Irving to 444999. It might say there's a fee, but there's no message fee unless you have a really weird phone plan that charges you for text messages. So if you text this number, it's going to ask you, you're going to get a text message, it's going to ask you 3 questions. Enter your email address, and then your first name, and then your last name, and then you're signed up. And then we'll send you a link for you to create a free will. It'll ask you questions, you'll fill it out, there's no credit card information. You fill it out, and you print it, and you sign it in front of 2 witnesses and a notary. And that is a legal document, which, like I said, is going to name a guardian for your children, it's going to pick an executor for you, and it's going to have the distributions. Very interesting. I'm very excited that the developer has been able to actually identify the shares for each of your beneficiaries. So you type in their names and it'll tell you who gets what from the Islamic inheritance rules. It's all going to be inside of the document. Okay? So is this working for people? Did you get a response message and you're filling it out? Not working? Okay, I see some yeses and some nos. It should be working. 444999. Pretty easy. I'm sorry? Yeah, the response is received from a different number. That's the one hang up. Just so you know, it's going to actually send you a message in a new thread. And you just respond with first your email, then it's going to ask you for your first name, then your second name, your last name, and then? The second message you get that says, please tell me your email, you just respond to the message. Okay? So the website for this, if you don't want to use this, is very easy to remember. It's muslim.estate. Right? This is something new that we were just working on. Muslim.estate, you can go and you can create a free will. And in it, it's going to ask you who your family members are. Do you have any debts? Do you want to leave gifts? I would encourage you to leave a gift to the masjid. And from there, you can do that. Now, Muslim.estate, E-S-T-A-T-E. Okay? So if you fill this out, you'll get it. You'll get the email, you'll get the information, you'll get the text message, you'll be on the list. It'll be very easy for you to fulfill. Okay? Now, there's a better solution. Okay? There's a better solution. Now, I should say about this will that we've done. This is a basic will, right? So it's kind of akin to something like TurboTax. Okay? If you're simple and you have basic needs, it's going to be sufficient. If you have complex needs, you have a lot of money, you have a complicated family, probably free things don't work for you, right? We all understand that, okay? But for those that are very simple, that's a starting point. From there we can build. So one of the better solutions is known as a trust. Who's heard of a trust? Anybody have a trust? A few people, right? So in fact, some of the commentators or American scholars, law professors have written that the trust was developed based on the Islamic concept of a waqf, which is really fascinating. That if you look at what our scholars and tradition has developed, it's benefited society. Everybody's heard of algebra, right? Who was it developed by? Right? Jabr. The guy's name was like Khwarizmi. I don't know how to pronounce it. Khwarizmi? Right? In his development of algebra, his book, Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, he's actually solving Islamic inheritance problems. That's how he developed algebra. Okay? So these are benefits to the world. Algebra, waqf, all of these things. So, now what the concept of a trust is like a bucket. You put everything inside the bucket. Your house, your ownership, you name the trust as the beneficiary on the different accounts, the retirement accounts and life insurance policies and so on and so forth. It owns the bank accounts, it owns the home, it owns the investment accounts, such that the trust never dies. So it never goes to probate. The next trustee who you've picked follows the rules that you've laid out and distributes the assets according to Sharia entirely outside of the court system. Completely privatizing the administration. Okay? Very effective, very efficient way to administer. And very importantly, it clarifies who owns what between the spouses. Because all of these numbers, they're kind of meaningless if we don't know who owns what. Like between my wife and I, who owns, the house. Or a husband might be assuming that his business is his, and she doesn't know, and there's a dispute over that. So we clarify all of those things inside of a trust. Now, do you lose control when you put something in a trust? No. A living trust, you don't lose control. It doesn't. There's no tax implications. It's just an effective way to consolidate and administer and manage your assets and distribute them according to Sharia. So additional benefits. Who's a business owner? Just kind of show of hands. Who owns a business? A few people, right? So 80% of businesses in America are family owned. They're not, giant Walmarts, publicly traded companies and so on and so forth. They're small businesses. Very few of them have a plan for what happens when the founder's gone. The successful families in American history that we talked about, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, all these famous families, even the Waltons, they were intelligent about creating a plan in which their business can transfer to the next generation. Right? This is something intelligent. You spend your whole life building a business. Why does it have to end when you are no longer there? So you can transfer ownership. Charitable planning. I talked a lot about this, wasiyah, right? Building our sustainable institutions, paying for missed religious obligations, and gifting people perhaps that aren't going to benefit, that aren't warithin from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Maybe you have a cousin who helped you, or a niece or a nephew that you really want to help, or a neighbor that you really like. You want to gift them something, and you have the ability to do so. And asset protection planning. Who's heard of that? There's probably a lot of doctors. You hear about how many lawsuits are filed every year in the US? How many? 1 million? It's higher. Huh? 10 million? It's higher. Right? It's 20 million on average, or estimated, lawsuits filed a year. We live in a litigious society. People hate lawyers, right? So I do planning work to avoid that. That's part of what we do. But the reality is you want to protect your assets. And so there are ways to do that inside of trust. There are different kinds of trust, more complex. The more assets you have, the more important these things are, right? So I want to close with a couple examples, have you pick or sort of vote on whether that person needs a will or a trust, and then I'll open it up for questions and answers, okay? So we have Khalid, who's an IT employee. He went surfing, and unfortunately, he got bit by a shark, and he passed away. Allah yarhamu. So he had a 6-year-old daughter, and he lived with his and parents. He was survived by a 6-year-old daughter and parents, and he rented his home, had a modest checking account, a 401k, and a life insurance policy from his employer. Do you think that he needed a will or a trust? A will would be sufficient, I would say, right? Because who's going to take care of his 6-year-old daughter? His wife is not in the picture. I don't know. Either she had a surfing accident before or something happened to her. His parents, right? The will is going to say that I want my parents to take care of my daughter, and the money's going to go to them, and they're going to take care of her. I would say that's okay, right? That's sufficient. He doesn't own a house, and whatever assets he have, they're going to go to his beneficiaries, which are his parents and his daughter, and that's going to be taken care of in a will would be probably sufficient for Brother Khalid. Sumayya owns a furniture company, successful furniture company. She's married for 21 years to her husband, has 19-year-old twins, and all of their assets are joint. The primary residence, they have a rental property, they have 401k, investments, all of those things. What about Sumayya? She needs a trust. Why? There's a lot of pieces. She owns a business. You don't want a situation in which the husband gets everything, then gets remarried, so on and so forth. And also the business transfer. You don't want a situation in which the business, somebody comes in and buys your business for pennies on the dollar because they know that there's no operation anymore. So anytime you own a business, you own a house, you have, a few $100,000 of assets, definitely a trust is the way to go. How about this brother, Dr. Khan? He's a partner. There are 2 partners in a medical practice, and Allah yarhamu, he passed away in a car accident. At a young age of 33, he's survived by his wife and 3 young children and parents. They recently spent all the money they had. They were very strict in avoiding interest. They didn't want to deal with riba, with loans, with mortgages, so he zeroed out his 401k and they bought a house in cash or a small home, and he has no retirement account or life insurance. What about him? A will? Will, trust, kind of the idea of this one was to put it on the fence, right? That you're never wrong with the trust. You can't be wrong with the trust. He might be okay with the will, but it's better off. They have a house that's owned free and clear. It's better for him. He's young and his wife is young and he has young kids. So they're better positioned to be in a trust. But at a minimum, at least he should have a will. But I would probably go 60-40 here on a trust. Say that it's better, but not as required or as important as it was in example number 2. Make sense? Everybody kind of understand the distinction of when you need a trust and when you need a will. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you time for Q&A. And I want to just go over the rest of my itinerary for the trip. So inshallah, I'm visiting from Arizona and I'm going to leave tomorrow night. So tomorrow I'm going to be here in the masjid. And for those of you that know you want to do a trust, there's a sign-up sheet. You can meet with me tomorrow. So you can schedule a time, you can meet, we can go over on a customized plan. Those of you that want to do your free will, you have all the information to do it. I would encourage you to fill it out, download it, develop it, sign it, notarize it, have all of that done. And those of you that aren't sure and have questions and stuff, you can also schedule calls with me when I'm back in Arizona as well, inshallah. So the sign-up sheet is there, my contact info is there, and if you do the text message, you can take my business card, and you can do the text message, and you will be able to answer. Now, any questions, we'll take them. Sisters, if you have questions, please send them down as well. Jazakumullah khairan. Yes. Yes. The question was, can I not fill out my beneficiary form on my 401k and have the will control? You could theoretically name your estate as the beneficiary and then have the will control. The problem there is that it goes through probate. It's not desired. It's not something that you want. In addition, the default is that it goes to the spouse under ERISA law, and there has to be a disclaimer. So you should, presumably like a trust will allow you to avoid that and name the trust as the beneficiary. But if you're naming the 401k, you can also name the Islamic Sharia beneficiaries in the 401k directly. That's another option potentially. But realize, if you name kids as beneficiaries, they can't inherit. They can't, if you name a 6-year-old child as a beneficiary of a retirement account, what's going to happen is that the court would require a guardianship conservatorship, which is expensive and unnecessary again. So again, there's ways to avoid that inside of trusts, or by naming someone to distribute for them. You name the parent or wife or whatever, and kind of just hope that they do it. Although that's not a great plan, but that's what people do if they don't do the trust route. Yes? Primary and secondary beneficiary. Primary and secondary. Primary means this is who's going to get it. Secondary means if that person is gone, then it goes to this person instead. You could put, the thing is, it's going to go to the primary. What is the best criteria? So, like I said, the optimal way is to do it through a trust and have the trust provisions control. Now, I recognize trusts, just to give you cost understanding on trust, typically they start around $2,500 and go up from there. So that's cost prohibitive for a lot of people, right? So you can do the spouse, kids as backup. You could name the beneficiaries all as beneficiaries. If you'd like that as well. Now, realizing that if you have young children, however, the court is going to require a conservatorship. And so that's a costly procedure. So typically people will leave the accounts to their spouse and then have some agreement with the spouse to make sure that they get done. But from an Islamic perspective and a legal perspective, there's no guarantee that that happens. Right? So there's a limitation. If you want to go through the conservatorship, guardianship process, then you can name all of the beneficiaries directly. There's another piece to that, which is sometimes people die in joint situations and the beneficiary you name is not there. Right? So there has to be a constant mechanism for recalculation, which again is best done inside of a trust. Yes? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So the good question was about estate tax. So that question may be moot soon, based upon the Republican tax plan. For some people, that's great. But the way estate taxes work is that they're $11 million. The first $11 million for a married couple is exempt. So it only impacts like 0.02% of the population. If you have more than $11 million, then the tax currently is 40%. So it jumps from 0 to 40. So in that case, you absolutely need not just one trust, but a whole series of trusts, right? And there's advanced tax planning that has to take place for people over 11. Now, the proposal is to double that exemption and then eventually eliminate it. And of course, the people who are proposing it stand to benefit in the tens of millions of dollars from eliminating the tax. So if you have more than that, that's one advantage of this tax plan, is that your beneficiaries will not be taxed. There's a big part of this which is taxes, which I didn't really touch on. There's income tax planning. You have assets, the different bases and things like that. Some are highly appreciated, some are not. So there's a whole host of things that need to be considered in advanced planning. Those are better suited in one-on-ones than general questions. Yes.
When I do a will,
Yes.
where the Quranic law goes, is it like all the distribution, the share?
Yeah.
Or I just make a will that my daughter will get 50%, my son will get 50%.
Good. So what's the best way to do a Quranic will? There's different ones. You've seen these templates perhaps online. People have different ways of doing these things. Different attorneys do them differently. I don't like the wills that say, I want to leave my assets according to Islamic law, and then have an attachment with 30 pages of what that is. You go figure it out, right? I don't like that mechanism. I also don't like a method in which you only say that 1/8 to my wife and 1/6 to each of my parents, and 7/12 to these beneficiaries, 7/24 or whatever to each of these, because there's a possibility that one of those people predeceases you, or that there's a mutual death. So it's a combination. The way that we do it in this app is that we calculate your current beneficiaries for you today, and then we have a mechanism for recalculation that your personal representative would be responsible for recalculating in the event that one of these people is no longer alive, based upon a schedule that we've attached, which basically lays out the rules of inheritance.
So I know someone that the person has like 3 daughters.
Yeah.
And he wrote everything without, it's like superseding the Quranic law. The person wrote all the part as well.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's common. The rule. Yeah, so. Right. The question is, if I write something different from what the Quran states, is that valid? Well, the first question is you're working in 2 different systems. From the legal system of the state, whatever you write controls. So if you write, for instance, I leave all of my wealth to my cat, people do it, right? Sometimes I had this whole conversation with a client once, and at the end of it, he said, well, what about my pets? Right? I mean, I'm thinking about this, but the pet is the most loyal being to the person. The kids are gone, they don't care about him. The pet comes and jumps on him when he comes home every day. So whatever you write controls. Now, do you write consistent with Islam or not is your choice. It's an obligation between us and Allah, right? That we have an obligation to fulfill the commandment. If you write something different, for instance, I've had clients that say, I don't like my kids, I want to leave everything to charity. Sounds noble, but it's sinful, right? It sounds great, I want to leave everything to the charity. But the reality is you can't do that. If you write it, it's going to go to charity. I mean, that's the law of the land is going to honor what your wishes are. But it's between you and Allah. Your beneficiaries have rights upon you. So this is the point where we have 2 different systems. The law of, whatever country that many of you came from, whether it's Pakistan or even India or Syria, or even if a person is living under Israeli occupation, they actually still honor the law of Islamic inheritance, whatever country you're from. So here that's not the case. What's going to be honored is what you write down in your will or in your trust, assuming they're legally valid. If they're legally valid, sometimes people just write things and hope that they get fulfilled. But if there's a legally valid will or trust, it's going to be honored by the court. And whatever you write controls. So if you deviate from the Islamic rules, that's a deviation from the Islamic rules. I mean, people do it, certainly, but that's not something we should try and do. We should try to adhere to the Islamic rules all the time, yes?
Where do you keep the will?
Oh, good question. Where do you keep the will is the question. You keep the original in a safe place. You need the original. So you tell the benefit. Sometimes people, they keep the original will in the box locker in the bank that says, I give this person the authority to access this box. You see the problem? It's not very productive, right? Because the key to that box is in the document, which is locked in the box. Okay? So you tell your beneficiaries, your trustee, your executor, where you're keeping these documents. Now, if you use a lawyer, then the lawyer will have a copy of your documents and so on and so forth. If you do it yourself, be it through this tool or whatever mechanism you choose, then you should keep a copy You should keep the original, and you can make copies and give them. And in fact, part of this, if your kids are old enough, it's worth having this conversation in person, because that mitigates a lot of the disputes. That you actually sit your kids down and you tell them, I'm picking so-and-so to be in charge, and I want you to follow the Islamic rules, and this is my wasiyah to you, and you ask them to fulfill those rules. So that there's a mature conversation. Now, if your kids are 4 years old and 3 years old, it's not a conversation to have. But if they're old enough, it's productive. Now.
So if you like 401k right now,
Yes.
and you mentioned beneficiaries, but you have make it 100% over there.
Yep.
But then you have a trust, which says you're not going to.
Yep.
So which one overrides? Does the trust override?
No.
Which override
The beneficiary form always controls. So you can name the trust as a beneficiary.
Oh, so you get the whole thing to trust?
You could, yeah. And then the inside of the trust would control. Yeah, you could do it that way. Yes.
In your first scenario that you had built on the projector, could you also at the end, after allowing the daughter to be taking care of the parents, then have the daughter write a trust, and then you would foresee someone else to take care of it if the parents died before she made?
Yeah. I mean, there's a host of things you can certainly do if you have kids. You know, there are wills. I gave simple examples, but there are, more complex examples. You can do trusts inside of wills. Now that's not what this tool is. This is a basic tool. But you can set up trusts inside of wills that, this trust is going to be for my daughter, and these are the rules that are going to govern her share, and she's going to get this percentage at this age, and this percentage at this age. You can get as complex as you want. Again, there are Islamic limitations to those things, but you certainly have flexibility and the ability to do those things. Yes. Any questions from the sisters? The thing is, it's an obligation on the husband and on the wife. This isn't one of those things you can say my husband is going to do. So if you have something, please write them down, or if you have a microphone, you can ask. Yes.
So who is the personal representative? Who can be represented?
Anybody can be the personal representative, whoever you pick.
Someone from, like, for example, like my brother who is out of his country.
Good question. So I don't recommend naming anybody out of the country. In the app, we've defaulted it to your spouse if you're married, and then you pick somebody. So who should it be? It should be somebody who is responsible, somebody who is trustworthy, somebody who is either local or can be local, but don't pick somebody overseas. Same with guardians. A lot of times people want to pick guardians back home. I would not recommend that. If you do that, make sure you have a local guardian as well, because maybe it takes them a week, 2 weeks to get here. What's going to happen in the interim? The state is going to be managing. It's not a good solution, right? So you have people, local, friends, family. If you don't have any, you pick friends, somebody. You ask someone in the masjid. And that's the beauty of our tradition and our community, is that, we've established brotherhood, sisterhood in ways that many people don't have. Like, a lot of clients come and they don't have anyone. They're like, I don't know, I don't have anyone, right? But within our communities, inshallah, we can find people that are trustworthy. As what? As a guardian of your kids? Executor? I doubt it. I don't think masjids are in position to administer estates. Maybe one day, once we have sophistication, but I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, you don't have the capacity to do those things. So you have to pick an individual. People, there are trust companies and there are professionals that do this stuff. If you have absolutely nobody, you can hire one of these people. But of course, you pay fees to do those things. Yes?
Yeah, if you have trust and you have children,
Yeah.
and you want to, in your life, you want to deed to them,
Yep.
your estate,
Yeah.
girls and boys.
All right, it's time to go home. Okay, so.
Can you give them equal?
Oh, great question. This is an excellent question. Wonderful. All right. So, wonderful question. is, can I gift while I'm alive? Do I still have to follow these inheritance rules? The answer is no. You do not have to follow these inheritance rules. Should you choose to give equally, you should give equally. In fact, if you want to give things to your daughter, I have, people that come to me and say, my son is a, successful physician, and my daughter is a, single mom, and she's a school teacher, for instance. And I need to protect her and to take care of her, and those are valid, legitimate concerns. So gift assets while you're alive. Absolutely, you can do that. Now, there's tax consequences. They have to be strategy. You got to talk to the accountant. You got to talk to the attorney potentially. So you have to be smart about them, but there's no restriction on your ability to do those things, other than the principle of adl and justice. Also, if that form is completely full, you can contact me and email me and talk to me, and we'll figure out times, inshallah. Maybe last question, then we'll close, inshallah. Good. The question is, do you explicitly list the assets in the will or the trust? Yeah, so in a trust we do, in a will we don't. In the trust we have to make sure we account for every single asset. Now if you add assets to it, no problem. You can add them. You want to subtract them, you want to sell them, you want to buy, you want to do that, no problem. In a will we don't identify what they are. You should. The more complex you are, the more detailed you are, the better. Often. Amend it. Well, you wouldn't need to amend it. You could just make a sort of a list next to it and identify these are my assets. Because oftentimes kids don't even know what parents own. Especially if you worked several jobs, you have previous retirement accounts, things like that, you don't know where they are. It's better for you to do that work than somebody to search for those things after you. Okay, last question, inshallah.
Is it possible to have joint wills, like husband and wives, they can have wills together?
Oh, good. Okay, another good question is, can you have joint wills? The answer is no. Can you have a joint trust? The answer is yes. So in a trust, you can have assets that are jointly owned. Wills are per person. Each individual has a separate will. Okay? Jazakumullah khairan. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, accept from us this knowledge, and protect and bless our families and our institutions. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. And thank you all for listening, and thank you all for participating. Jazakumullah khairan.
So is there any difference between like a firqa, like the Sunni or Wahhabi? Is there any, in terms of will, is there any difference?
Good question. There's not. Assalamu alaikum. There's not